The webinar will begin in just a couple minutes. We're just letting people into the Zoom. Thank you all who have joined us today. The webinar will start in just a minute. We're just letting some more folks in. So watching the numbers go up. Thank you for your patience. We'll be with you in one moment. We'll be starting shortly. We're just letting people into the Zoom. You know, in advance, there's a Q&A box. If you have questions for the participants, you're welcome to shoot us your questions there. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. How are you today? I hope you're well. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Michelle Eaton. I'm the Vice President of Public Affairs at the Ontario Chamber of Commerce. And, you know, very excited for today's discussion. Today's abrupt new reality arising from the COVID-19 pandemic is shining a spotlight on the critical role the food and beverage industry plays in our province, our country, and around the globe. The food processing industry has always been instrumental in providing a safe and reliable source of food, but now their role is more important than ever. The industry and its supply chain are being tested, and so far it's getting the job done, but not without its challenges. As we continue to navigate the crisis, we are pleased to bring this opportunity to have a conversation with industry leaders about current state of the food processing supply chain and the steps for recovery and strengthening the industry. So we have an incredible panel with experts from our members from BDO, Niagara College, Advantage Group International, and Maple Leaf Foods to discuss the current state and future of the industry during economic recovery. And today's opportunity would not be possible without the support of our amazing web series partners. Thank you very much for your generosity, Bruce Power, Canada Life, Hydro One, Waste Connections, and the Chamber Plan. Big thank you to you all. Now it's my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, David Linton, who's a partner at BDO Canada LLP. He's partner in BDO's Mississauga office and leads BDO Consulting's National Manufacturing and Distribution Industry team. He has worked with a wide range of manufacturing and distribution organizations, including capital equipment, aerospace and defense, electronics, food and beverage, breweries, clothing and consumer goods, lumber, chemicals, paint distributors, and wholesalers. So thank you so much for joining us. Over to you, David. And just, David is having some internet connections, so we might have to switch mid-webinar to me, but hopefully his internet keeps up. David, if you could unmute and join us, that'd be great.
Thanks, Michelle, and thank you for everybody for joining the webinar today. We've got a great group of panelists. What we're going to be doing is I will give you a brief overview of how BDO sees the food and beverage industry is going to fare over the next 2 years and possibly slightly longer. The panelists will each then be presenting on select topics discussing the recovery in the food and beverage industry. And then we're going to be getting into a Q&A session. So please, as we go through this, if you have a question, post it in the Q&A, and we'll be covering back and answering some of the questions that come up during the session today. Okay, so if we can move on to the next slide. What I'd like to do is talk about what BDO sees as the impact of the current COVID situation will have on manufacturing and the food and beverage industry specifically. What we have on the left here is statistics that were published by Stats Canada and analyzed by the CME in May, showed the GDP contraction by industry subsegment. Overall in manufacturing, the projection for 2020 is a 13% reduction in GDP. Of course, not every subsector is equal, and the good news for food and beverage, at least, is the projected reduction in GDP in 2020 for the food industry is a relatively modest 3%. Of course, it will vary according to the types of products, the channels to market, and so on. What I would like to say is we're past the initial hump of pivoting and addressing the immediate challenges that the current situation put in front of us. But we do appreciate that the impact is going to continue to be felt, first of all, until a vaccine is available to allow more of a back to business as usual. And then in addition to that, the resulting recession is exited. So I think we all recognize that we're not in this for the short haul. We do need to be considering as businesses to pivot from the initial response and enabling day-to-day business to continue and start to become more strategic on and planning for our business's recovery and growth in the next couple of years. So just digging a little further, next slide, please. So BDO has done some more analysis using the various projections. I'll give you a more up-to-date statistic. The OECD yesterday published their projections for 2020. For Canada as a whole, the OECD predicts that in 2020, GDP will shrink between 8 and 9.4%. So depending on how recent the reviews are and which industry segment you're looking at, we do predict that there will be significant continuing challenges. When we did the analysis, we looked at both historical recessions and previous pandemic information, broke it down into the industry segments, and projected both the severity and the duration of the impact of the current situation by subsector. So you will see up at the top there, the food and beverage industry. We've plotted this out over 24 months. We do anticipate that it's going to be 6 to 12 months before there is a reasonable amount of normality in the food and beverage industry, but that is dependent on a number of factors, and right now we are continuing to assess the likelihood and the continuing impact of the current situation. So if we go to the next slide. So when we consider what we believe are the main continuing disruptions and challenges that need to be addressed over the next approximately 2 years, for the food and beverage industry, we believe there are 5 that need to be focused on when considering how to continue to operate our businesses. The first is supply chain disruptions. To a certain extent, food and beverage and other manufacturers had already been somewhat impacted by the rail blockade at the start of 2020, but the impact of COVID was felt pretty early, as our traditional supply chains, direct materials, ingredients were impacted. Packaging supplies were affected. Doubly so if packaging SKUs need to be adjusted for adjusted sales channels. And we anticipate that the supply chain disruptions will continue to a lesser extent, and there is a certain dependency on wave 2s and reoccurrences of lockdowns in the supply chain and the impact it will have. The other side of the supply chain, we've seen disruptions on the go-to-market, the sales channels, whether it is different products being demanded, the closure of retail and excuse me, in hospitality, and therefore needing to pivot to different sales channels with different packaging requirements and so on. Businesses need to be considering what the long-term strategy is on both the input, the supply side, and also on the demand side, to minimize the supply chain disruptions. The second is that we have seen margins being eroded significantly as a result of the pandemic situation. Direct material costs have increased, which has driven up the cost of products. The productivity in production in some cases has been reduced by the need for physical distancing. The indirect costs related to keeping the workforce safe have driven up costs, and potentially reduced revenues have had an impact in margin because some costs are fixed and the revenues have reduced. And therefore businesses need to determine ways to improve their margins over the next 24 months, recognizing that some of these challenges are not going to go away. The third is workforce management. We do need to continue to focus and build more long-term strategies in terms of employee communications. There's a lot of stress and anxiety in the workforce right now, and we anticipate that anxiety will continue, and therefore employee communications need an additional focus to help our staff feel safe in the workforce, to minimize the risk of people not coming into the workplace. And the second part of this is as conditions change, we need potential workforce shortage contingency plans in place to ensure that production can continue when there are workforce shortages looming or happening. The fourth and fifth are very much interconnected. I'm sure that all businesses have been doing regular cash flow forecasting and working capital management. I think this really has exposed the fact that our planning and forecasting processes and potentially tools are not really designed for the need for us to be rapidly changing our forecasts and plans. The result is right now that those processes and tools are perhaps not adequate to allow us to be confident in our cash flow forecasts and help to determine who we should be paying and when our revenue is going to be coming in. And that can impact our business decision making with the added risk that we are either going to be committing to capital projects that we may not have the cash flow for, or the flip side being overcautious when the cash flow projection is not so bad. And then finally, we are unfortunately seeing some solvency issues coming up in the manufacturing industry and a little bit in the food and beverage industry. We do project, unfortunately, those financial stresses will increase, particularly over the next 3 to 6 months, as some businesses that are financially stressed are going to be needing to determine a path forward. And therefore, we should be planning as businesses to cater for that. So with that, what I'd like to do is introduce our first panelist. So I'd like to introduce Lyndon Ashton. Lyndon is the Centre Manager for the Canadian Food and Wine Institute's Innovation Centre of Niagara College. Lyndon is responsible for the overall operation and strategic leadership of the centre, including outreach to key industry partners and the successful development and implementation of food and beverage innovation services. His diversified career started in the culinary arts and eventually led to economic development, management consulting, and business planning. With a passion for food, business development, and strategic planning, Lyndon brings a client-centered focus to the Innovation Centre, which recognizes that combining talent development and knowledge transfer through value-driven research and development supports are key ingredients to the recipe for economic success. So with that, I'll pass it over to Lyndon.
Great, thank you very much, David. And just trying to bring my video on here. I think I'll need some help from the organizer. So I'd just like to take a moment to thank both Michelle and Rocco for allowing us to be a part of this. It's a very important subject and something that's certainly very close to our hearts. Before I start, I'd just like to take an opportunity to thank all of the frontline workers, without whom we'd likely be in a much worse situation than we are today. And also, we'd like to take a moment to acknowledge all of the essential workers, those people operating in the grocery stores, in the logistics, in the manufacturing, all the folks that have been out there putting themselves at risk in order to do some very important things to keep us safe and secure, like keeping us fed. So I think we'd be remiss if we didn't give an acknowledgement to them for sure. So if we could move to the first slide, one of the things that we'd like to do is just give you a bit of an understanding of what the landscape has been like for us. You know, naturally, I'm speaking from the perspective of our Research and Innovation Division at Niagara College. But I'd also like to point out that within this innovation ecosystem that we have, there's a whole variety and host of different organizations. You know, Colleges Ontario is a very strong supporter of the economic development, workforce and talent development environment that's very important. And that comprises not only organizations like ourselves at Niagara College with things like the Canadian Food and Wine Institute Innovation Centre, but also includes our colleagues at George Brown, at Conestoga, Durham, and Loyalist College as well. So as we go through this, keep in mind that what I'm talking about is the landscape and the perspective of what's going on in Niagara, and then, you know, a broader context in Ontario, but also include an opportunity for you to look to supports from your local divisions and your local institutions as well. So with the slide titled The Landscape, one of the things that we've certainly identified from the beginning is a sudden disruption. This has had a chilling effect on research and development, not only within your organizations, but through us as well. So as hard hit as you folks have been with looking at how you've had to have this immediate switch from innovation and a focus on growth and bringing new products to market, it's forced you to switch to meeting demand, to dealing with some difficult issues around having the right levels of PPE in place, the incurred costs that are associated with this, but also put the institutions in a position where about mid-March, we had to shut down and lock down operations just in order to ensure we were fulfilling our obligations and mandate to the community to keep ourselves, our students, and our researchers and workers safe. Next slide, please. So one of the things that's happened is we've recognized that through the work with our industry partners, our associations, there's been a ripple effect, that's happened due to hospitality closures, a decrease in demand. I mean, we work very closely with the craft beer and wine industries, among others, and they've been very hard hit in Niagara, as well as I'm sure across Ontario and Canada as well. And a lot of this, particularly in craft beer, has to do with issues surrounding non-packaged beer, the amount of inventory and stock that is just simply sitting in restaurants through licensees that can't be used. And although production may not have been immediately hit through the wine industry, it certainly was reflected in issues surrounding licensee resales, the drop in tourism. So all of these have played, a serious effect on what's happening locally and across the province as well. Another thing that's quite interesting and certainly unique to the food and beverage sector is there's been different impacts that have occurred. There's situations in which some large producers, can't keep up with demand. They've had challenges ensuring that they can meet all of the increased demands that are occurring because people are actually staying at home, being forced into situations where they're now rediscovering what it means to cook at home and spend more time with family. I think at one point during this, I was speaking with somebody, an association colleague, and they'd even indicated at one point it was hard to find chicken in Burlington. I mean, this is, a pretty serious thing when it comes down to something like that. But with respect to a lot of our client base of small and medium-sized food processors, and speaking for ourselves at Niagara College as well as across, the different innovation system networks that we have, there's been a difference. There's been a difference in the recognition that something that may not be recognized as an essential by the clients and by the consumers out there is just not simply having the same kind of selling power or uptake. And so we've certainly noticed there's been uneven and varying impacts along these different sub-industry and sub-sector lines. Next slide, please. So one of the things with respect to some opportunities, because naturally out of every challenge, out of every difficult situation, it presents opportunities. As I'm sure has been no surprise for some of you who've been watching the news around COVID-19 and some of the things that have been happening, there's some fast movers that have been able to look at what they're doing, recognize that there's been such a strong drop in demand that it's forcing them to be nimble, retool, and convert their operations into producing different now in-demand goods. I mean, one of the most obvious examples of this has been a lot of different operations converting to produce PPE and more particularly hand and surface sanitizers. So, I mean, we've seen this locally in our area with different brewers and distillers looking at how they can not only rally to the call of support that's necessary, but also find ways to overcome some challenges and lost revenue in order to meet this new demand. I think one of the opportunities that's come out as well is for a while now, there's been a very strong trend towards local, knowing where your food is coming from. This is certainly supported by a number of different innovative approaches, not only through industry, but by government, local economic development offices. But I think that's something that's certainly coming out of this and that, a lot of folks are publishing about is the recognition of the need to get back to local supply chains and understand the value of local sourcing and supporting other organizations within both up and downstream of the supply chain. So one of the things that we've noticed in the work that we've been doing and the discussions we've been having with some clients as we look at ways that we can kind of retool our own approach to how we're providing innovation services is this understanding that packaging is likely an area that's going to provide a lot of opportunity for innovation. And when we look at sectors, say for instance, like the wine industry, moving towards concepts of single serve, so that it reduces the amount of the need to use the same kind of package or bottle to serve multiple people, but can fall in line with keeping up with distancing measures and other measures that are in place to ensure that people can keep themselves safe as we continue now through the process of phase transitioning back to some type of situation where we can actually connect with other people and move out of self and quarantined isolation. Where this leads to as well is just different notions around direct-to-consumer activities, ways to conduct virtual business in food and beverage and responsibly distance food and beverage experiences. Again, going back to the issues that have really hit hard on a lot of industries like the grape and wine industry, like the beer industry, that are very much integrated into the hospitality, entertainment, and recreation avenues and environments of how people go about consuming these products, finding innovative ways that we can go about approaching these and helping the clients that we have. Product development, a lot of what has been done traditionally by ourselves, and I know a lot of different colleague organizations across the ecosystem, has been very much focused on product development because we've been in a major upswing until COVID-19 occurred, where everything was being done as much as possible from different levels of government with funding, innovation organizations to really help drive the increased competitiveness in small and medium-sized enterprises to continue to create and introduce viable new products into the market through retailer chains and other distribution networks. So I don't see that this is necessarily going away, but perhaps what it's calling for is a way to reformulate or refigure how we're providing these products. And although there's been a dip in that demand for non-essentials, most certainly, how can we look around lower cost yet good quality products that we can be providing some variety around items that are recognized as staples or more commonly desired products? And perhaps in particular as well, looking at how we can rebrand or brand ourselves in a manner that's going to provide these types of valuable products that illustrates that they're done in a manner that is safe and follows safe supply chain and good manufacturing practices. Next slide, please. So I think one of the things to keep in mind about all of this is the fact that there's an innovation network out there that's comprised of local colleges, universities as well, and we're there to support everyone with the challenges that they're going through. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Lyndon. I think that provided some valuable insights and considerations for how food and beverage businesses need to potentially be pivoting and looking for innovative products to bring to market in the current times. What I'd like to do now is introduce the second panelist, Dwight Konings. Dwight is the Vice President of Global Client Development, North America, of the Advantage Group International, Inc. Dwight has over 30 years experience working with North American and global clients and has become a leading advocate for building trust between business partners to collaboratively improve business engagement. Dwight began his career at Colgate-Palmolive before spending 15 years with Nielsen, where he managed manufacturer and retailer relationships, trained clients and internal associates, developed and launched various product enhancement initiatives, as well as leading both merchandising services and store observation services. Since joining Advantage 9 years ago, Dwight has led commercial and market development, insights and innovation, and is currently leading the Canadian business and several global clients based out of North America. And Dwight, over to you.
Thank you, David. Appreciate the introduction, and I appreciate the Ontario Chamber of Commerce giving us the opportunity to come and speak to you today about a topic that's important to us, and I think it should be important to everyone here, which is about engagement. We really think that if an important area to focus on coming out of the crisis is going to be on making sure you're improving your engagement with the business partners that you work with. And if you could go to the first slide, please. Thank you. So to put it in perspective, why should you start thinking about engagement? It's important to set the landscape. So as the COVID-19 started hitting around the world and countries started going into lockdown, what you found was people having to start working in ways they've never done it before. They went from, maybe getting up, getting on a train, going to the office, to working from a home where maybe their kids are still at the house. They've got animals running around. I had a cat jumping on my computer initially till I learned to lock the door to keep it out. But at the same time, the grocery business became deemed an essential service. And if you talk to some of the executives out there, they hadn't really thought about our business being essential service before. They had designed things like their supply chain to really about minimizing costs, improving efficiency, and just in time. It wasn't designed for the kinds of demand spikes and changes in consumer purchase habits that we've seen here, where a lot of people would go to the stores on the weekends, then they started shopping during the week. When what they were buying and when they were buying it all changed. So they had to retool in real time to adapt, and the only way they were able to do it effectively is through strong engagement with their business partners. Now, at Advantage, we've been working with a lot of the largest manufacturing retailers. We're Canadian-based, but we operate in over 40 countries. So we had the benefit of being able to start looking at what was happening to how companies were working together live as each country was going through the crisis. So we were going to field asking questions of senior executives in both manufacturers and retailers during this. When China was right at the peak, we started, and then Italy and Spain. We did it in UK and Brazil to understand what was changing and how are companies navigating this to get through the crisis. And if you could go forward a slide, I'll share the key learnings. What it really showed us is that, if anything else, it's demonstrated that partnerships truly matter. We have a tagline you'll see at the bottom there, it's better together. And it has never been more true than right now, that the way to get through this is you need to work better together if you're going to get through this and recover faster. And if we were to summarize all the learnings from the manufacturers and the retailers and what they told us of what worked and how they got through this, here's the three big changes that happened. Relationships became more trusting because they had to be. They had to adapt in real time, where before there might have been processes and they had to do checks and do things before they could move things forward. They had to start trusting more than in the past that they could collaboratively figure out what needed to be done, have the other person just go away and do it. So the trust improved. To do that, they also had to become much more transparent. They had to share more information than they would have done before the crisis. And then if you look at the third point, it really, before the crisis, we talked a lot about collaborative planning, working together to figure out where to go in the future. During the peak of this, really what it became about was collaborative problem solving. Sharing information on issues and opportunities, figuring out what needed to get done, and then working together jointly to solve problems in near real time to move forward. And if you can move the slide forward, please. So that's kind of what we were learning. We were seeing similar things in patterns across the markets we were looking at. Now in Canada specifically, we started our Advantage Engagement program this year, where we collect feedback from suppliers and retailers to understand how they're showing up. And we added a special question this year, collaboration during a crisis situation. And we're still collecting that feedback now, but we've got some of the early feedback in, so I wanted to share with you today what each side is saying is working, because you need to start thinking about these kind of things if you're going to be successful in the business partnerships you're having in the industry. So from the supplier side, proactive communication became very important. In the past, they may have been hesitant to say, for example, I have a problem, I'm not going to be able to provide some products that you want. They had to become transparent and proactive and start sharing, here's what I can do, here's what I can't do. And then on the retailer side, what became important was more communication. So where in the past, perhaps conversations were going on monthly or maybe weekly, it became daily or even hourly. So they opened up and became much more available for their business partners so they could problem solve together. And then the suppliers had to, on their side, manage a lot of changes because of the shifting consumer habits. So, for example, everybody knows toilet paper became very important for some reason. You don't need promotions on toilet paper during a time when you can't even get it on the shelves. So, and if you look through all the products, they had to start really adapting and being willing to shift promotions that maybe had been locked in a long time previously. They had to look at their assortment. One of the problems was they couldn't keep up with demand on some of the products. To solve that, some of them proactively went and said, we're going to discontinue or stop producing some of our other variants of products so that we can get the main, at least one of the key items on the shelf. So they reduced their assortment to become more efficient to deal with the huge increase in demand. And then the retailers on their side had to adapt to how consumers were purchasing. That's where you saw the big move to trying new formats, things like click and collect. I was at listening to one of the presidents of one of our key retailers in Canada last week, and he said that the movement to online has probably moved forward about 3 years from where it would have been today, if not for the crisis. With the investments in that, there'll probably be some fallback, but this has given retailers the chance to change how they deliver their route to market to consumers. And it's given consumers the chance to consider new formats. And there were challenges. I mean, I know I tried to buy products online. It took 2 weeks at first to get a slot, but it's getting better and better now. But the key is it's adapted, and it's not going to go back to the way it was when this is done. So everybody needs to start thinking about if this becomes the new normal. We saw increases in the number of people assigned to online business, whereas I was at a conference in the fall, there might have been 2 or 3 people in a company. Now there's large groups of people that have been assigned because it's not going to go back to the way it used to be. Suppliers had to better manage the expectations on time in full, whereas before they might have been trying to get to 98% fill rates. They're just trying to get some key items over there. And on the retailer side, we saw more empathy. They understood that they weren't going to be able to get everything. They maybe walked back on things like fines and things they may have been doing in the past, and they worked and were more flexible with the manufacturers. So overall, it was a real improvement in how both sides were working together. And it wasn't even. Some companies were already working like this leading in, and they performed better through it. Others had agile cultures that allowed them to adapt quicker during the crisis. And others just either weren't set up or didn't pivot fast enough, and they suffered from it. If you could forward the slide. And then the other thing that you need to think about, because there's your external business partners, and then there's other partners that you work with. We pivoted ourselves and started putting a bigger focus on associate engagement. We actually developed the Voice of Associates in a crisis program, which we used ourselves at Advantage, but then we also started using it with clients, recognizing that if you're going to be successful and able to work collaboratively with your business partners, you have to have engaged associates that, and we wanted to help understand what was maybe issues in associates engagement during the crisis. And for the most part, what we found is a lot of companies adapted really well to this, and there were significant changes going from working in offices to working from home, recognizing and being flexible that people maybe had kids at home that in the past they didn't have. So what it did is it led a lot of them to make significant changes, and it was appreciated by the associates. But we did see across the programs we ran that there's 3 areas in the programs that were standing out as issues that everybody should really be making sure they are focused on and have a plan on. One of them, obviously, it was job security. Because no one knew what was going to happen. You see the costs are cutting. We see companies cutting people. So an example of a learning is do it in one wave. If you had to if you're going to have to do some changes to the organization, try not to do it in a drip fashion over time. That just increases the job insecurity that's out there. Another area that came up was well-being at work, and some companies did extremely well. You saw some of the retailers start to do things like putting up those plastic, I call them the spit shields, but I'm not sure what their official name is, but to protect the cashiers, and that helps with the security and well-being of the associates in the office. And then the one that stood out across everything was stress management support. So we saw that had much higher rates than a lot of the other practices that we were looking at. So I know at Advantage, we had stress management programs in place, but we had to re-educate people on what was available because it hadn't been as important before, and other companies needed to focus on that as well. If you could go to the next slide. So what I'd leave you to start thinking about is, and we've kind of put it in on one page of some of the areas we're starting to think about. You've gotten through the worst of the crisis, but it's by no means over. I mean, I'm in an area where the Ontario's starting to open up again. We're starting to be allowed to go out again, but we could have another wave coming. And the kind of things you need to start thinking about as an organization if you're going to help recovery in this industry. What is your crisis readiness capability? Have you thought about that? Have you codified it? Do you have people working on making sure you take those learnings and move forward? How you partner with companies is changing. You're going to have to be thinking seriously about how you're going to work with them going forward. Is your culture agile? Are your people policies agile? They had to become that way, but are you going to continue that going forward? How resilient is your supply chain? A lot of it was on efficiencies, but you've got to put more emphasis on resiliency so that in peaks like this, you can adapt quicker. And innovation, product development is going to be critical going forward. And with people cutting back on spending, you've got to make sure you've still got money flowing into those areas for future growth. And the final slide, just to close. So at Advantage, we really think that what matters through this is that you really consider and start making choiceful decisions around the engagement you have internally and with the associates that you need to partner with to move forward. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Dwight. Really appreciate your insights into the need to increase and improve collaboration with partners and internally within organizations, and also your insights into what you see organizations need to be planning for in the upcoming months. I'd like to introduce our third panelist now, Rory McAlpine. Rory is Senior Vice President for Government Incentives Industry Relations at Maple Leaf Foods. Rory has responsibility for working with government and industry partners on matters of public policy, programs, regulatory affairs, and trade. He brings to Maple Leaf Foods a wealth of experience gained through more than 30 years of working in the government, trade, and agribusiness. Prior to joining the company, he held several provincial and federal government positions, including Deputy BC Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Fisheries, Director and Director General, Trade Policy Directorate of the Federal Government, Director Grains and Oilseeds Division, and Deputy Director Multilateral Trade with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. Rory serves on a number of government and education boards related to the food industry, and I'd like to pass it over to Rory now.
Okay, thank you, David. And thank you to the Chamber for doing this and for the ongoing series of really good webinars in the last several weeks. So you'll be aware that Maple Leaf has a number of plant operations, both in Ontario and across the country. I could talk a bit about, obviously, the supply chain impacts, the absenteeism challenges, the big impact to our food service business, and to the shift in markets generally. But I'll come back to any of those things if you'd like to ask questions about our business specifically. But I thought I would just take a few moments here, hopefully leaving here lots of time for some Q's and A's, to reflect a bit on the broader industry developments and the government policy and program kinds of issues that we've been involved with over the last few weeks to try to manage the crisis in the agri-food sector, and what we can learn about its resiliency and some recommendations I have for the future. I mean, on balance, as you've heard, we've done much better, obviously, than many other sectors of the economy. But at the same time, I think what we've learned is that we have an agri-food system that's somewhat vulnerable. I can quote actually my friend, Dr. Evan Fraser from the University of Guelph, who observes that you know, we're much more aware of an agri-food system that might be described as brittle due to high volume, high speed throughput, border uncertainty, just-in-time order fulfillment, and minimal redundancy. So all the things that make the system exceptionally efficient and low cost in normal times become problematic in a crisis. And the kinds of issues we faced at the beginning with the panic buying and so on made this system very hard to adapt quickly. But nonetheless, it did adapt, and we sit here today having, I think, achieved quite a bit, both in terms of maintaining domestic and imported food supply to consumers in Canada. But what can we learn? So I had some immediate thoughts. The first is, from a government sort of policy point of view, there does, in my view, need to be a single inclusive evidence-based sort of post-mortem or lessons learned exercise. I believe there will be such an exercise conducted by Public Safety Canada, but I do think it's really important that we don't waste the opportunity. As is often said, I think it was Winston Churchill said, in every crisis there's an opportunity. So we have to learn from this, because some things went well, but some things have not gone well, and we can do better. The second point would be that we have learned there is no overall cross-agency government industry business continuity plan for the agri-food sector in Canada. There is one in the United States, there is one in other countries, where they've recognized that after the healthcare system, in a crisis like this, probably nothing matters quite as much as your ability to feed the population. And so the idea of having a plan that would identify roles and responsibilities to deal with operational crises is really critical. And particularly when you're dealing with an event that is not time limited specifically, and it's not location specific, it's across the country, it's every location. And it reveals that there are roles and responsibilities in managing our supply chain and even the government regulatory aspect of this that needs to be managed. And if you don't work from a plan, things will not go as well as they should. So we don't have a plan in Canada. I'm certainly hoping we will build such a plan based on this experience. And the final point here would be that there needs to be a governance model to do this, that we need each other. As we've discussed, you quickly realize who your friends are. You need to have a trusting relationship. But some of the processes by which decisions are made in peacetime, if you will, in the normal course of developing plans and programs and solving problems in the sector, don't work very well if you don't have a pre-existing kind of governance model that's able to deliver timely and informed decisions in the midst of a crisis. And in agriculture and food, and in fact, our own company, you may know, Maple Leaf had a terrible crisis in food safety over 10 years ago. And this sort of crisis, be it food safety, animal health, these are not unusual in agri-food. And we need to have a plan or a process by which we engage to mitigate those crises and work very closely together in a more formalized structure. Next slide, please. So what can we do then? So we know the system is resilient, but it can be strengthened. There are a number of risks that we have to manage for. I'll give you one example. Of course, we've had a terrible pandemic, but there is far worse pandemic risk out there. And much of it does actually relate to the agri-food sector, because the majority of these pandemic viruses start in the animal agriculture population. The H5N1 influenza virus, which is found in poultry, has a mortality rate in people of 50 to 60%. Imagine. Now, its transmission from poultry into people is very minimal. It has occurred. But if that virus ever gets into the pig population, the species barrier is much less. You could have a horrific global pandemic. And these are the kinds of things where our industry and our governments need to really be planning for. So the kinds of things that we may want to do to focus on. First, we do need to look at the economic health of subsectors. The parts of the industry that serve food service, for example, are not in good shape. And the food service restaurant industry is coming back, but it is not going to return to normal. And the volumes and the issues, the pricing and so on in that have to be addressed. So we need to look at this, because that impairment is going to last for some time. Secondly, we're in a future scenario now where undoubtedly trade protectionism and subsidization is only going to grow globally. Canada's hugely export dependent in agri-food. You can see the billions being poured into subsidization south of the border. You've seen countries impose export restrictions because food self-sufficiency has become a real preoccupation. And that's going to really challenge our export-oriented industries. And we have to dig into that, and we have to align with countries to fight back that tide of protectionism. Thirdly, we live in this country under a program framework in agri-food called the Canadian Agricultural Partnership. It's a recurring 5-year cycle of program development. And some of that needs to be rethought. We've learned some things in this crisis, particularly around the so-called agri-recovery pillar, that is to deliver programming for crisis scenarios right down to the farm level. And it has struggled to deliver timely programming that we need. The next would be, in Canada last year, there was the announcement by the Trudeau government of a food policy for Canada. And it was an attempt to bring together all different federal government mandates as they relate to food into a cohesive policy program. Everything from innovation to trade to, the whole issue of food security in Canada. That needs to be rethought. We've realized it's important, but we have to rethink it. And that final point, food security, we take this very seriously at Maple Leaf. We've got now a doubling of food bank use in Canada. And this is a crisis that's going to persist. We've got to really figure out how do we address the chronic problem of food insecurity in Canada. Next slide. So the conclusions of this, I would say, are 4. We know our sector has made and can make a huge contribution to Canada's recovery, perhaps more than any other sector of the economy. Right, and this is critical, both for the sake of the economy, but also, as we've discussed, from a social, environmental point of view. The food sector matters, and Canadians get it. They're now more aware, frankly, of food affordability, food availability, and the notion of local and food sovereignty is very high in the concerns of Canadians now as a result of this. Secondly, we need to look at how to attract investment, create employment. I mean, we've got in this sector the opportunity immediately to be hiring thousands more unemployed Canadians that have been dislocated by the crisis. But it has the potential to grow and to attract way more investment and create even more employment. Thirdly, we need to look at how to pivot both business models and government thinking towards resilience, risk prevention, sustainability, innovation-driven growth. These are the drivers that have come to the fore very, very realistically. And then finally, in terms of the crisis, where we've got evidence that our decision-making processes don't work, particularly in a crisis, we need to look at governance reform. I'm concerned about that, frankly, in my business around animal health, because a foreign animal disease could enter Canada. The big one in the pork sector is African swine fever. It could shut borders to Canadian pork in an instant, and this would be devastating to a $24 billion industry. And to get ahead of that, we need to have a good governance model to bring industry and government into a mode of much more active prevention and preparation for future events. So I'll stop there and looking forward to the Q's and A's. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Rory. That was a great insight, combining both the knowledge of the government organizations, but also bringing the food processor perspective to this discussion today. So we're now moving into the Q&A portion of this. We have 6 or 7 minutes before we need to wrap the session up. Very quickly before we get into the panelists answering some of the questions that have come in, one did come in related to the presentation I provided. The question was, how was the COVID-19 impact for different industries determined? In summary, through the use of artificial intelligence, BDO has a division called LIXAR. We used historical data such as previous recession information and data related to GDP through different financial crises, current information such as publications from Stats Canada, OECD, and also various other data sources from commodities prices to a number of other data points, and use that to project the impact by severity and duration for each industry group. So with that, now we're going to open it up to the panelists, and let's start with the first question for the panelists. And the first question we have is, what do you see as the medium to long-term impact on consumer spending habits?
So I can jump in on that one to start with. From a perspective of what they're going to be able to buy is going to be linked to what's available. The same as people really showed up differently, products did. It highlighted ones that were important and ones that they could do without. So I think the long term, there will be less availability for consumers. Longer term, innovation is going to be critical to start getting assortment back for consumers.
Right. Thank you, Lyndon. Sorry, Dwight. Linda, maybe you can chip in on this?
Sure, yeah. I mean, there's been a trend before COVID, certainly moving towards healthier options in food, ethically harvested, clean label, and plant-based foods. Some of the research that's been coming out of the U.S. is showing that during the pandemic, plant-based foods were actually on a dramatic increase. This could be due to lowering in demand or availability for meat-based products. But I think all of these areas are going to be important, and I can certainly see that packaging is going to play a very important role in how we innovate and think about how we deliver our product to the customer.
Great, thanks, Lyndon. And Rory?
Yeah, I was going to comment too on the plant-based foods. Maple Leaf has moved into that space, and it's enjoying tremendous top-line growth, and that continued or accelerated even through the pandemic. But alternatively, I guess what we've observed is somewhat of a return to comfort foods, if you will. You know, there's kind of that cocooning thing, family meals together again, a little more traditional food. We've just one example, we make lunch kits, right, for families to give kids going off to school. That has collapsed because nobody's sending kids to school. So there's these various things, but I don't know. I think in the end there'll be a lot of stabilization. The big one is the impact in food service, and that's where I guess the future is quite uncertain as to how that will return and what time frame. But I'm not sure there's going to be very many dramatic, lasting impacts to consumer behavior in the months ahead.
Great, thanks, Rory. The next question is a combination of a couple of different ones. But if you were to pick one positive coming out of this crisis, what would it be? Maybe Rory, you can go first this time.
Well, the comment was made about trust, right? And there's no question. Again, I think of our whole agri-food sector. Every time we go through a crisis, we all learn together. We realize that there's some things we do in normal times that are adversarial and just inappropriate, or could be addressed through a much more trusting, collaborative value chain approach to the way we work. And I think again that's occurred here. So from what we've learned, let's keep that going. The relationships in our customer interfaces, the way we have helped keep grocers stocked in key items, and the way we've just kind of set aside, we have all the challenges around order fulfillment and penalties and things like that. Some of that behavior, I think, can probably be modified, because we've learned, it's not always the best way to ultimately satisfy the customer, which is, what we should always be focused on.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you, Rory. And Lyndon?
I was just going to say, yeah, I'd just like to build on that too. I certainly agree. And I think that, the demand is even stronger in the push towards local sourcing, local supply. And I think the notion of the collaboration that Dwight brought up earlier as well, and that Rory's talking about, is really important. I think finding ways out of this, a good outcome is finding ways to make local commerce work, and to look at the partners that we have both up and downstream in the supply chain, and how we can be supporting each other instead of just shifting to other markets or looking at ways to squeeze productivity or additional cost savings.
Okay. All right, great. Thanks, Lyndon. And Dwight, do you have one to add?
Yeah, mine's very similar. The key thing that we see is the improved collaboration. But why that's important is it was noticed at senior executive levels that we collaborated more through the crisis, and it helped. And they maybe had not all seen that before, that how important collaboration was. And we're just hoping and working on promoting that we keep being as collaborative going forward as we were during the crisis.
Okay, excellent, thank you. Moving on to the next question. Was there a key learning in the last couple of months from your organization you'd like to share? Dwight, do you want to be first up on this?
Yes, mine's all about engagement. We've always been focused on business partner, external engagement. What we learned out of this was there's more areas of engagement you need to focus on. That's internal engagement's critical. That's why we did the Voice of Associate program. We're also starting to think about customer engagement. So I've got kids going back to university. I'm going to be starting up a program for universities and college to get voice of their students in all of this and to recover, think about engagement. Thank you.
Okay, Rory?
Well, I would focus first and foremost on the occupational health and safety learning, right? The reality of protecting our workforce from an infectious disease, recognizing that in food manufacturing, we typically do have a high labor concentration at given sites, people working closely together, and that's very challenging, right? Again, those measures of efficiency and proximity that help make a plant work well are problematic, and we've adapted a number of things. We've made a number of changes in the physical and the PPE and all of that. But I think we've learned through this that, you know, we just have to take this seriously for the future, because like I say, there could be another event. And as much as, you know, in food, we're very familiar with risk. We're familiar with invisible pathogens in our manufacturing environment. But at the end of the day, we can only partially control the hazard here, right? That hazard, that virus comes into the plant. People work 8 hours a day in the plant, but the rest of the time they're in the community, and the risk of disease transmission in and out is going to be a chronic problem. And to your earlier point, until there's a vaccine, we're going to have to just live with that. And there's some real learnings and actually some cost consequence to that.
Yeah, thank you, Rory. And Lyndon?
Yeah, I'd say the importance of flexibility and agile innovation. I mean, we're all part of a network where we focus on being at the vanguard of innovation and pivoting where necessary. But just like companies, when we get into good streams of delivering services that work really well, we always need to be focusing on how we can ensure that we can pivot when the time is right. I mean, we're there to help companies, to help them in innovating according to market demand. And something like this just proves once again that we have to be ready to pivot quickly and to collaborate. We're a member of something called Tech Access Canada. It has 47 technology access centers across Canada that are funded through the Natural Sciences and Research Engineering Council of Canada. So finding ways that we can cross-collaborate across countries, across provinces, in order to find innovative solutions quickly to meet those market demands and the shifts that happen that our industry partners need. I think we may have lost David.
I think we may have, and that, you know what, that it's just about time anyway. So thank you all for such an extremely insightful discussion. Big thanks to our moderator, David, and I'm glad his internet, you know, it did almost to the end. Lyndon, Dwight, Rory, really appreciate your time today. So grateful you could all share your incredible insights with our audience. And again, today's opportunity would not be possible without the support of our web series partners. Big thank you to Bruce Power, Canada Life, Hydro One, Waste Connections, and the Chamber Plan. Please join the OCC for our next webinar. It's going to take place on Thursday, June 18th from 12 p.m. to 1 p.m. for a discussion on 5G as the next evolution for mobile network technology. So the Ontario Chamber and the U.S. Consulate in Toronto have assembled a panel of experts for a timely discussion on the risks and opportunities that should be top of mind for Canadian decision makers. And we're delighted that our guest speaker is going to be Melissa Hathaway she's the president of Hathaway Global Strategies, LLC. She served under both Presidents Bush and Obama as a cybersecurity expert. So I'm really excited for this next one. Again, thank you all for joining us today. Thank you again to our wonderful panelists. Have a wonderful Thursday.
Thank you.
Thank you.